Imagine a civilization that has been running, essentially uninterrupted, for over 2,000 years. A system of emperors, mandate of heaven, scholar officials, and traditions that stretch back so far they predate the Roman Empire. That was China, and for the last 268 years of that history, it was ruled by the Qing dynasty, the Manchu rulers from the north. They were the last emperors, and their reign ended not with a glorious final battle, but with a slow, agonizing whimper caused by the clash of a colossal, ancient state with the brutal efficiency of the modern world. If you want to understand the Chinese Revolution, you have to understand the century of humiliation that preceded it. Starting in the mid-19th century, China was not just defeated by Western powers and Japan, it was systematically humiliated. The Opium Wars forced China to open its ports to foreign trade, essentially by making millions of its citizens addicted to drugs imported by the British. The subsequent treaties, which the Chinese called the unequal treaties, carved up the country into foreign spheres of influence, where European powers and Japan had economic and legal control. This wasn't colonization in the traditional sense, but it was just as effective. China was the patient on the operating table, and foreigners were the surgeons, taking whatever parts they wanted. Domestically, the Qing government was too weak to stop it, which completely shattered the idea of the mandate of heaven. How can you be chosen by heaven if you can't even protect your own people? This internal weakness led to massive, bloody rebellions like the Taiping Rebellion, which killed tens of millions of people and nearly toppled the government, leaving the dynasty permanently crippled. The Qing tried to modernize with reforms, but every time they took one step forward, they took two steps back, often because conservative elements within the court feared modernization more than they feared foreigners. The final, crushing blow came in 1895, when a tiny, modernized Japan utterly defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War. The message was clear: China's ancient system was totally incapable of defending itself. The only answer for a generation of young, Western-educated intellectuals was revolution. Their spiritual father was a man named Sun Yat-sen. Sun was a doctor, educated partly in Hawaii and Hong Kong, who believed China's only hope was to completely tear down the imperial system and replace it with a modern republic. His philosophy was simple, memorable, and powerful: the three principles of the People's Minjuyi. These three pillars were nationalism ending foreign control and uniting the Han Chinese, democracy establishing a representative government, and people's livelihood, social welfare, and economic equality, often interpreted as land reform. Sun spent his life in exile, tirelessly organizing, fundraising among overseas Chinese, and launching a series of failed uprisings. The revolutionary movement was small, fractured, and mostly based abroad, but the constant failures of the Qing dynasty meant the ground was fertile for change. The revolution itself was largely accidental. In October 1911, in the city of Wuchang, a revolutionary bomb accidentally exploded. The local Qing garrison troops, who had been secretly infiltrated by Sun Yat-sen's allies, mutinied because their plot had been exposed, not because they were ready for a full-scale revolution. This local uprising, known as the Wuchang Uprising, triggered a domino effect. One by one, province after province declared independence from the Qing court. The entire 2,000-year-old imperial system simply collapsed under its own weight in a matter of weeks. The last emperor, a child named Pui, abdicated in early 1912. Sun Yat-sen, who was in the United States fundraising when the revolution happened, rushed back and was elected the provisional president of the new Republic of China. But here is where the super-simplified story gets complicated. The revolutionaries were disorganized, lacked military muscle, and only controlled the southern provinces. Beijing, the capital, was still held by the strongest military figure in China, General Yuan Shikai. Yuan was an ambitious, seasoned general who controlled the modernized new army. Sun Yat-sen, realizing the republic would be crushed if he fought Yuan, made a fateful choice. He resigned the presidency in favor of Yuan Shikai, in exchange for Yuan forcing the abdication of the emperor and formally recognizing the republic. The deal was done, and Yuan Shikai became the new president of China. The promise of democracy lasted about as long as a spring shower in the desert. Yuan Shikai was not a democrat. He was an ambitious warlord who wanted to be the next emperor. He systematically undermined the new republic, dissolving the national and provincial assemblies and even having the parliamentary leader, Song Jiaoren, assassinated. The Nationalist Party Kuomintang, or KMT, which was founded by Sun Yat-sen's allies, tried to mount a second revolution against Yuan, but it was easily crushed, and Sun Yat-sen was forced back into exile. The Republic of China, founded on the beautiful principles of nationalism and democracy, was already a hollow shell. Yuan Shikai then made the colossal mistake of declaring himself Emperor of China in 1915, attempting to restore the imperial system. The move was met with immediate, widespread opposition from almost every faction in China. Even his own generals abandoned him. The monarchy lasted less than 100 days. Yuan died shortly after, in 1916, of natural causes, but his death left a massive power vacuum. With no strong central leader and no functional central government, China fractured. For the next decade, from 1916 to 1928, China descended into the brutal chaos known as the warlord era. China was effectively divided among regional military strongmen, or warlords, who fought endless, localized wars against each other, subjecting the population to heavy taxes, forced conscription, and extreme violence. The Republic of China existed only in name. The chaos and the continued weakness of China, especially against foreign powers, fueled a new wave of radical thought among the youth. The last straw for many came in 1919 with the May 4th movement. China had joined the Allies in World War I, hoping to reclaim German-held territories in its own country. Instead, the Treaty of Versailles gave those territories to Japan. Students and intellectuals took to the streets in Beijing in massive protests. The lesson was learned. Relying on the West for justice was futile. China had to save itself, and the old systems, even the Republican one, had failed. This desperation and intellectual ferment opened the door to a completely new, imported, and incredibly powerful idea: communism. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, was founded in 1921, initially as a small study group backed by the Soviet Union, but it held the one thing the warlord era lacked: a coherent, radical vision for the future. The two major forces that would fight for control of China for the next 3 decades, the nationalists and the communists, were now born. The chaos of the warlord era was a military and economic disaster, but politically, it was a testing ground. Out of the remnants of Sun Yat-sen's Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang KMT, two strong leaders emerged. The first was Sun Yat-sen himself, who returned from exile to set up a new base in Guangzhou, determined to reunite China under his principles. The second was a young, ambitious military officer named Chiang Kai-shek. Sun Yat-sen was the philosophical face, but Chiang was the sword. Recognizing the KMT needed a modern, centralized army, Sun Yat-sen, in a move that defined his pragmatism, allied with the Soviet Union, which provided money, advisors, and weapons. As part of this alliance, the small Chinese Communist Party was allowed to join the KMT in what became known as the First United Front. The goal was simple: unify China by military force. In 1924, Chiang Kai-shek was appointed the commandant of the Whampoa Military Academy, established with Soviet aid. This school trained the elite military officers who would form the backbone of the Nationalist Army. The alliance between the KMT and the CCP was always one of convenience. The Communists saw it as a way to grow their influence and organize workers and peasants, while the KMT saw them as useful foot soldiers against the warlords. This fragile alliance was built on a ticking clock. In 1925, Sun Yat-sen, the only man charismatic enough to hold the KMT's competing factions together, died. His death removed the political restraint on the rising star, Chiang Kai-shek. The moment for action came in 1926 with the launch of the Northern Expedition. This was a massive military campaign led by Chiang Kai-shek, aiming to sweep north from Guangzhou to defeat the various warlords and reunite China under the nationalist banner. The expedition was wildly successful. The nationalist forces were better trained, better equipped, and, crucially, had the powerful political backing of the population, which was exhausted by the warlords. The Communists played a key role in the success, not through military means, but by mobilizing peasants and workers ahead of the army's advance, setting up local governments, and organizing strikes that paralyzed the warlords' resistance. As the nationalist army neared the great cities of Shanghai and Wuhan, the deep ideological fault line between the KMT and the CCP became a chasm. The success of the Communists in organizing powerful labor unions and peasant movements terrified the conservative, landowning, and industrialist wing of the KMT, which provided the party's financial backing. Chiang Kai-shek, who was fundamentally anti-communist, was faced with a choice: complete the military unification of China or eliminate the threat growing inside his own alliance. He chose the latter. In April 1927, in a move known as the Shanghai Massacre or the April 12th Incident, Chiang's troops, with the aid of criminal gangs, violently purged the Communists from Shanghai. Thousands of labor union members, communist leaders, and leftist sympathizers were rounded up and executed. This betrayal marked the catastrophic end of the First United Front and the savage beginning of the Chinese Civil War. With the Communists violently purged from the cities, Chiang Kai-shek completed the Northern Expedition, capturing Beijing in 1928, and established the official nationalist government of the Republic of China in the new capital, Nanjing. China was nominally unified, but Chiang's attention was now obsessively focused on one task: annihilating the communist remnants. The Communists, meanwhile, were decimated. The urban-focused, Soviet-advised leadership of the CCP was shattered. The surviving Communists fled to remote, mountainous areas to regroup, and it was here that a new, revolutionary approach emerged, championed by a little-known peasant organizer from Hunan named Mao Zedong. Mao's genius was recognizing that the revolution would not be made by the urban proletariat, as per classic Marxist theory, but by the massive, disenfranchised peasantry of the Chinese countryside. He organized the peasants, promising them land reform, and established secure, self-governing enclaves known as Soviets in the remote mountainous region of Jiangxi. Mao's strategy was simple: guerrilla warfare, luring the enemy in deep and then striking them from unexpected angles. Chiang Kai-shek responded with a series of 5 massive military campaigns, known as the Encirclement Campaigns, aimed at utterly destroying the Jiangxi Soviet. For the first 4 campaigns, Mao's brilliant guerrilla tactics successfully defeated the much larger nationalist forces. But in the 5th campaign, Chiang adopted a new strategy devised by German advisors, the blockhouse strategy. He slowly built concentric rings of fortified concrete blockhouses, tightening the noose around the communist base, starving them of supplies and manpower. The new leadership of the CCP, which had sidelined Mao, foolishly abandoned his guerrilla tactics and attempted to fight the nationalists conventionally. They were utterly crushed. Faced with total annihilation, the CCP leadership made the agonizing decision to evacuate their base. This was the beginning of the legendary Long March in October 1934. About 86,000 men, women, and administrative personnel broke through the nationalist lines at the weakest point and began a year-long, grueling strategic retreat across China's most inhospitable terrain. The march was not a triumph, but a desperate flight for survival. They crossed 18 mountain ranges, 24 rivers, and marched over 6,000 miles, 10,000 kilometers, constantly harassed by nationalist forces, warlords, and disease. Casualties were staggering. Only about 8,000 to 9,000 soldiers of the original army survived. However, the Long March became the single most important event in the history of the CCP. In January 1935, during a brief stop at the town of Zuni, the surviving leadership held a conference. They blamed the disastrous defeats on the failed conventional tactics and officially reinstated Mao Zedong as the military strategist, effectively making him the undisputed leader of the party. The survivors finally arrived in the desolate, mountainous region of Yan'an in northern Shaanxi province in late 1935. They were a shattered, tiny remnant, but they were survivors. The Long March was instantly mythologized, becoming the defining epic of communist resilience and giving the party a powerful, heroic narrative to rally popular support. The communists had survived and now had a leader, a base, and a revolutionary philosophy tailored perfectly for the Chinese peasant. The stage was set for the next, much larger conflict, the invasion of Japan. Even as the nationalists and communists were locked in their Civil War death struggle, a far greater menace was watching from the sidelines: Imperial Japan. Japan had long viewed China as a resource-rich and strategically vital neighbor to be exploited. In 1931, Japan manufactured an incident to invade and conquer Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. Chiang Kai-shek, still obsessed with destroying the communists, adopted a policy of appeasement toward Japan, famously saying, "The Japanese are a disease of the skin. The communists are a disease of the heart." He believed internal unity, the elimination of the CCP, had to come before external resistance. This policy was deeply unpopular, particularly among his own military. In 1936, a group of nationalist generals, furious that Chiang was fighting fellow Chinese instead of the Japanese, dramatically kidnapped him in the Xi'an incident. They held him hostage and forced him to agree to a new alliance with the communists. This led to the formation of the Second United Front. In 1937, following the infamous Marco Polo Bridge incident, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, beginning the brutal and devastating Second Sino-Japanese War, which became the Pacific theater of World War II. The war was a disaster for the nationalist government. Japan's highly mechanized armies quickly captured the major coastal cities, including Shanghai and the capital, Nanjing. The rape of Nanjing was one of the worst atrocities of the war, where Japanese troops unleashed a 6-week reign of terror that saw hundreds of thousands of civilians murdered and tens of thousands of women sexually assaulted. Chiang Kai-shek was forced to retreat deep into the interior, setting up a wartime capital in Chongqing. The Nationalist Army, the KMT, bore the brunt of the fighting in major conventional battles and suffered colossal losses. However, the war served as an existential test that exposed the KMT's flaws. They were plagued by endemic corruption, poor management, and crippling hyperinflation that destroyed the lives of the urban middle class who had once supported them. Their armies often mistreated the peasants, and their government became increasingly viewed as dictatorial and ineffective. The communists, by contrast, thrived during the war. Based in Yan'an, they used guerrilla tactics to harass the Japanese in the rural north. This strategy gave them to massive political advantages. First, they were seen as the most dedicated resistance fighters by the local peasants, earning them immense popular goodwill. Second, by focusing on land reform and improving local governance in the areas they controlled, they were directly solving the economic problems of the rural masses. While the KMT's power shrunk to the area around Chongqing, the CCP's influence and military strength grew dramatically. By the end of the war in 1945, the Communist Red Army had gone from 8,000 Long March survivors to a force of nearly 1 million soldiers, with millions more in local militias, and controlled vast swaths of the northern countryside. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the uneasy Second United Front immediately collapsed, and the Chinese Civil War resumed, this time for total control of the country. The two sides were vastly different. The nationalists, KMT, had superior numbers, controlled all the major cities, inherited much of the Japanese equipment, and had the crucial, unwavering political and financial backing of the United States. But their army was exhausted, their morale was low, and their government was utterly corrupt and unpopular. The Communist CCP were militarily weaker on paper, but had decisive advantages: leadership and popular support. Mao Zedong, Lin Biao, and other commanders were brilliant strategists, and the CCP's promise of land reform galvanized the peasantry, who made up 80% of the population. They provided an inexhaustible supply of food, intelligence, and recruits. The final phase of the Civil War, 1945 to 1949, was decided not by tanks and planes, which the KMT possessed, but by logistics and popular will. The war shifted dramatically in 1947 and 1948. The CCP, now rebranded as the People's Liberation Army (PLA), adopted a strategy of encircling the cities from the countryside. They cut KMT supply lines, forcing their armies to waste resources defending isolated urban garrisons. Massive battles, such as the Huaihai Campaign, saw the PLA destroy entire KMT armies. Faced with total economic collapse and military defeat, KMT troops began to desert or defect in droves. On October 1, 1949, from atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace Tiananmen in Beijing, Mao Zedong delivered the historic, thunderous declaration: "The People's Republic of China is established." The announcement marked the end of over a century of civil war, foreign aggression, and political upheaval. The Chinese Revolution, which began with a sputtering explosion in 1911, was finally over, creating the unified, communist-led state that defines China to this day. The Civil War created the lasting political reality of two Chinas: the People's Republic of China on the mainland and the Republic of China in Taiwan, a division that remains one of the world's most delicate flashpoints.